The Year to Their podcast, it's time to start the show. Be sure to hold on tight, here we go. Exploring all the different Disney destinations. Year to Their, it's time to start the fun.
Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Year to Their podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week. I am your host, Phil Gramlich, and each and every week I will bring you a different Walt Disney World word and then give you tips, tricks, background, history, hints, information. I could keep going all day about that word. So let's get right to it. This week's word of the week is brought to you by the letter F. F for Fritos. And you might be thinking, what the heck does Fritos have to do with Disney, right? And the answer is actually an awful lot, right? There is a ton of history between the Frito-Lay Company and the Walt Disney Company, going all the way back to the earliest days of Disneyland. All right, so let's start there. Let's jump in the DeLorean. Let's jump in the Countdown to Extinction Time Rover and go all the way back to 1955, the opening year of Disneyland. So way back then, Disney had a contract, a sponsorship by Frito-Lay. And yep, that's the same Frito-Lay company that we know and love today. So when Frontierland first opened in Disneyland in 1955, there wasn't a whole lot to see or do there. And there certainly wasn't a whole lot to eat in the opening day Frontierland. But in September of 1955, a new establishment was opened in Frontierland. This was the quick service or counter service restaurant called Casa de Fritos. Now, the original location for Casa de Fritos in Disneyland was pretty close to where the Riverbell Terrace is now. And the Riverbell Terrace was, if you don't know, one of Walt Disney's favorite places in all of Disneyland. He used to actually go there for breakfast often in Disneyland in the morning. Obviously, in the morning, right? I mean, it's breakfast. Listen, I like breakfast any time of the day, to be quite honest with you. But usually, we eat breakfast in the morning. Okay, back to Casa de Fritos and Fritos overall. Let's get back to the story. So, because of the sponsorship between Disney and Frito-Lay, Casa de Fritos kind of quickly becomes a hit. And Disney is selling Fritos everywhere, right? They're selling Fritos with pretty much every meal that comes out of that part of the park. And if guests just wanted a bag of Fritos, if they didn't want the entire meal, there was actually a vending machine that was in the shape of the mascot for Fritos, the Frito Kid, where people could put money in and get their bag of Fritos directly from the Frito Kid vending machine / statue. If this sounds a little weird to you, upon reading this for the first time years ago, it sounded weird to me too. But listen, this was Disneyland, Southern California in the mid-1950s. So Fritos were kind of a new thing back then. And yes, they were taking Southern California by storm. So within 2 years, the Casa de Fritos was so popular that it outgrew its little spot over there by where the Riverbell Terrace is. So they actually moved the restaurant to a larger, more centralized location in the middle of Frontierland. And here is where the story of Casa de Fritos takes a really cool, unexpected twist. And I'm not going to promise you an M. Night Shyamalan kind of ending here, but it's still interesting. At least I think so. So here we go. So Casa de Fritos was selling Mexican-style food and using Mexican-style tortillas to make the food. They actually got their tortillas delivered by a company called Alex Foods. Now, around 1960, a salesman from Alex Foods saw Disneyland cast members dumping the stale tortillas that they did not sell the day before in the trash. So he goes up to the cast members and tells them, whoa, fellas, don't throw these in the trash. Instead, cut them up into little triangles and fry them and sell them as a separate dish. So that's exactly what the Disneyland cast members started doing, right? They started taking the old tortillas, cutting them into triangles, and frying them into chips. Then they added a good amount of seasoning and started to sell these seasoned tortilla chips in the Casa de Fritos restaurant. So fast forward a few months or a year later, and a man named Archibald Clark West, who is a marketing executive for Frito-Lay, just happens to be in the park, right? He swings by Casa de Fritos. He tries their seasoned tortilla chips that they're selling, and he absolutely falls in love with this new snack. He goes back to Frito-Lay and tells his bosses, presumably, all about the snack that he found at Disneyland. Archibald West and Frito-Lay get in touch with Alex Foods and strike an agreement where Alex Foods will make these chips for Frito-Lay themselves. And in 1964, the new chip that was invented in Disneyland gets a name, and it is the Dorito. Please insert M. Night Shyamalan music here. Actually, I'm not going to put any music in, but by 1966, Doritos were rolled out to a national audience. Alex Foods was no more a part of the equation, and Frito-Lay started making these chips themselves. And the rest is history. So with that awesome history, I'm assuming you must think that Casa de Fritos is still in full operation in Disneyland, right? I mean, how could the birthplace of Doritos be anything but a nationally protected historical Disneyland site? Unfortunately, that is just simply not the case. In 1982, the Casa de Fritos was getting pretty worn down and wasn't as well attended as it used to be. So Disney shut it down for refurbishment, with most guests thinking that it would come back. Unfortunately for us Fritos fans, it did not. And in 1982, Disney terminated its sponsorship with the Frito-Lay company. The Casa was opened later that year as the Casa Mexicana, or I'm going to try to say this. Please, my Spanish-speaking friends, don't hate me for this. The Casa Mexicana, and that sounds like a question mark because I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. But this version of the Casa stayed open until the year 2000. There it is again. In the year 2000. When Rancho del Zocalo finally opened in that spot, and that has been open and is still open to this day. Okay, so there is a little bit of a story, a tiny story that comes out of this whole thing that might be my favorite part and may go down as my favorite part of this week's Word of the Week, right? So remember Archibald West, the guy who brought Doritos from Disneyland to Frito-Lay in 1961? Yeah, so he became a lifelong Dorito fan, right? I mean, literally lifelong. Actually, it goes a little further. His obsession with Doritos went a little bit further than his life did. So when he passed away in 2011 at the age of 97, he had left instructions for his family to pour bags of Doritos into his grave where he was being buried. I honestly think that may be the best ending to a Word of the Week podcast that I will ever do. And you know what? Now I am pretty sure, like 75% sure, that I want to be buried with the peanut butter and jelly burger from the ESPN Club. Or maybe the peanut butter and jelly milkshake from 50s Primetime. Or the pretzel, the soft pretzel from Germany. Man, I can't decide. And that is going to do it for this week's Walt Disney World Word of the Week. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This was a really fun one to do. I mean, come on, who doesn't want to talk about Fritos and Disneyland and Doritos and getting buried with Doritos for 10 minutes? That's a lot of fun. And actually, this leads me to a question, right? And I usually don't do these questions at the end, but I need to know the answer to this one. Which Disney food would you like to be buried with? It could be an appetizer, a snack. It can be from Disneyland or Walt Disney World or the Disney Cruise Line. But if you had to pick one food from Disney to take with you through eternity, which would it be? Just go to my Facebook page, facebook.com/ear to there, Phil, and you'll be able to answer the question there in the comments for this episode of the podcast. So I'm really looking forward to seeing your answers there. And again, thank you so much for listening to this episode. And thank you for listening to each and every episode that I put out there. As always, it is greatly appreciated. And if you did like this episode, please just tell someone about it. Listen, we all have that Doritos fan, that Doritos crazed person in our lives. I remember when I was in high school, I was so super health conscious that every day after school, I would stop at the corner store near my house and get a huge bag of Doritos and a big slam. Remember Big Slams? A big slam of Pepsi and polish it off while I watched the cartoons. And those cartoons were usually the Disney Afternoon selection of cartoons. And yes, I did say I was in high school watching the Disney Afternoon. Anyway, tangent alert, you probably know a big Doritos fan like I used to be. So just let them know all about this episode and other episodes. I'd really appreciate it. And thank you in advance for that. Just remember, there will be a new episode of the Walt Disney World Word of the Week each and every Wednesday morning, as well as a new episode of the regular Ear to There podcast each and every Monday morning. So until next week, thank you again so much for listening. Have a great week. Bye-bye.